a clearing in the foothills of Mount Kenya, just after dawn on the 6th of February 1952. The young Duke of Edinburgh was asleep in a room at Sagana Lodge, a wooden cottage given to him and his wife as a wedding present by the people of Kenya 4 years earlier. His private secretary, Mike Parker, an Australian naval officer who had served alongside him in the Pacific, and who was by then perhaps his closest friend, came in quietly and asked him to step outside. There, on the veranda, Parker told him what the wire services had been carrying for nearly an hour. King George VI was dead. The young woman, still asleep in the next room, who had spent the previous evening watching elephants drink at a waterhole, was now Queen of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth. Parker would describe the moment many times in the decades that followed, and the description never substantially varied. Philip, he said, looked as though half the world had dropped on his shoulders. He did not speak for some minutes. When he did, it was to ask for a newspaper so that he might check the report against another source before going in to wake her. Then he walked back into the lodge, sat with his wife on a sofa, and told her that her father was dead. There is no transcript of what passed between them in that room. There is no diary entry, no later memoir, no carefully placed leak to a sympathetic biographer. What there is instead is the conduct of the next 69 years. And that conduct, according to the small group of men who worked most closely with him, was governed by a private undertaking he made to her in the weeks that followed. He never wrote it down. He never spoke of it in public. He described it in pieces only to aides he trusted absolutely. Mike Parker first, and later Sir Brian McGrath, who would serve as his treasurer for more than 2 decades. The substance of it was this: whatever the personal cost to his career, to his name, to the family he believed he was building, he would not allow his private frustrations to undermine her in public. Ever. On any subject, in any room. Parker, interviewed years after his own retirement, put the matter as plainly as it can be put. Philip's project from that February onwards was to ensure that the Queen would never have to look over her shoulder and wonder whether her husband was making her job harder. McGrath, more cautious by temperament, said something similar in a different register. The Duke, he observed, regarded any public sign of resentment as a kind of desertion. He kept the promise, both men said, until the day he died. To understand what that promise cost him, it is necessary to understand the man who made it and the life he had been quietly assembling for himself before the news from Sandringham arrived. He had been born Prince Philippe of Greece and Denmark on a kitchen table on the island of Corfu on the 10th of June 1921. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, was the son of a Danish king imported to rule a Greek throne. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, deaf from birth, and possessed of a religious intensity that would, in time, separate her from the world. Within 18 months of Philip's birth, his father had been court-martialed by a revolutionary tribunal in Athens, narrowly escaped execution, and been driven into exile. The infant Philip was carried aboard a British cruiser in a cot improvised, according to family legend, from a wooden orange crate. He had no country. He had, very nearly, no family. What followed was an education conducted in the corridors of other people's houses. He was passed between relatives in France, Germany, and Britain. His sisters married into the German aristocracy. One of his brothers-in-law would later wear an SS uniform. His mother was committed to a sanatorium in Switzerland in 1930 when he was 9. His father drifted to a small flat in Monte Carlo with a mistress and would die there during the war, leaving his son a signet ring, 2 ivory shaving brushes, and a suit. By the time Philip was a teenager, the practical responsibility for his upbringing had fallen in large part to his maternal uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, a man of vast ambition and considerable charm, whose attentions to the boy were neither disinterested nor unwelcome. Out of this scattered childhood, Philip had constructed something solid, a naval career. He entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in 1939, where he finished top of his class. He was mentioned in dispatches at the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941 for his work on the searchlights of the battleship Valiant during a night action against the Italian fleet. By the end of the war, he was one of the youngest first lieutenants in the service. In 1950, he was given command of his own ship, the frigate HMS Magpie, based in Malta. The Malta years, from 1949 to 1951, were the only period of his adult life in which he and his wife lived something close to an ordinary married existence. Elizabeth flew out to join him for long stretches. She drove herself around the island. She went to the hairdressers like any other officer's wife. Their first child, Charles, had been born in 1948, their daughter, Anne, in 1950. Photographs from that period show a young couple in their 20s, sunburned and informal, who appear to be making a life. Philip, those who knew him then agreed, was on a clear professional trajectory. The view inside the Admiralty was that he might, in time, have risen to First Sea Lord. They had been married since the 20th of November 1947, in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey that Churchill, watching post-war Britain still rationed and grey, had described as a flash of colour on the hard road that lay ahead. In preparation for the wedding, Philip had renounced his Greek and Danish titles, been received into the Church of England, taken British citizenship, and adopted the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family. He had given up, in other words, almost every external marker of who he had been, in order to become the husband of the heir to the British throne. It had not seemed at the time to be the largest sacrifice he would be asked to make. The death of George VI at Sandringham on the 6th of February 1952 ended all of it in a single morning. The naval career was over. The household in Malta would be packed up by other hands. The expectation of being, in the ordinary sense, the head of his own family was gone before he had finished his coffee. He was 30 years old. The plane carrying them home landed at Heathrow on the 7th of February. A small group of black-coated men stood waiting on the tarmac. Churchill, the leader of the opposition, the Lord Chancellor. Elizabeth descended the aircraft steps, alone. Philip, watching her go, waited a beat and then followed. He positioned himself, deliberately, one step behind her on the tarmac. It was the first public enactment of an arrangement that had not yet been spoken aloud. She came down the steps in black, and he was already in position. Photographs from the afternoon of the 7th of February 1952 show the new Queen, 25 years old, descending alone onto the Heathrow tarmac, while her husband held back by a single, deliberate pace. No one had instructed him to do so. Protocol, in fact, allowed him to walk beside her. He had decided otherwise, somewhere between Nairobi and London, and the decision would harden, over the following weeks, into something closer to a discipline than a habit. The first test came almost immediately, and it did not concern affection. It concerned a name. Within weeks of the accession, rumours reached Queen Mary that the House of Windsor might be quietly succeeded by a House of Mountbatten. The source of those rumours was Lord Louis Mountbatten himself, who had been heard at a dinner at Broadlands, observing with satisfaction that the Mountbattens now reigned. Queen Mary was 84, ill, and entirely capable of acting. She sent word to Winston Churchill. Churchill, who had never warmed to Mountbatten and who regarded the question of the dynasty's name as a matter of state rather than of family, took it to Cabinet. In April 1952, the ruling was issued. The royal house would continue to be called Windsor. Elizabeth, advised by her Prime Minister and her grandmother, signed the proclamation. Philip learned of the decision after it had been made. According to his cousin Patricia Mountbatten, who repeated the line in interviews late in her life, and to the biographers Giles Brandreth and Ingrid Seward, who corroborated it independently from separate sources within the household, his private reaction was unambiguous. "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba," he said. "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." He said it more than once. He said it to Mike Parker. He said it in a moderated form to Brian McGrath. He may have said it to Elizabeth, though no record of her response survives. What he did not do was say it to a journalist. He did not say it at a state dinner. He did not allow even a flicker of the grievance to surface in the photographs of the spring and summer of 1952, in which he can be seen smiling at the correct moments and standing at the correct distances. Parker, asked about it years later, was characteristically direct. Philip, he said, considered any public sign of resentment a betrayal of Elizabeth. He would not give the press the satisfaction. He would not give the courtiers, many of whom he regarded as having engineered the decision, the satisfaction either. The rage stayed in the room it had been spoken in. This was the first enactment of the promise, and it set the template. Private fury, public silence, on any matter touching the sovereign's authority. The promise did not require him to be cheerful. It did not require him to be patient with footmen or polite to ambassadors he found tedious. It required only one thing, and it required it absolutely. The second test was longer in the staging and more public in its conclusion. On the 2nd of June, 1953, in Westminster Abbey, Philip knelt before his wife, placed his hands between hers, and swore to be her liege man of life and limb. The ceremony had been 13 months in preparation. The Coronation Commission, the body responsible for arranging every detail of the day, was chaired by Philip himself. He had organised, down to the order of procession and the choreography of the homage, the ritual of his own subordination. He made jokes about it. He complained to Parker about the weight of the robes and the absurdity of the schedule. He suggested, in a meeting that startled some of the older courtiers, that the ceremony be televised, and won the argument against the initial resistance of Churchill and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The televising of the coronation was Philip's intervention, and it transformed the monarchy's relationship with the public for the rest of the century. But the moment itself, when it came, he performed without visible reservation. He knelt. He swore. He kissed her cheek. He stepped back. A photograph survives of him in the carriage afterwards, looking, for one unguarded second, exhausted. It was the only such image. By the time the carriage reached the palace, the face was arranged again. The third test was domestic, and, in its way, the most revealing, because it concerned not a public ceremony, but a private address. Philip had spent much of 1949 and the early part of the 1950s overseeing renovations at Clarence House. He had chosen the fittings. He had supervised the wiring. He had, by his own account to Parker, looked forward to raising his family there, in a house that was, by the standards of royal residences, modest, manageable, and his. Churchill insisted on the move to Buckingham Palace. The Prime Minister considered it constitutionally necessary that the sovereign reside in the sovereign's house. Philip argued. He argued, by various accounts, for several weeks. He lost. The family moved. He told Parker, in a phrase that has been quoted often enough to have become part of the household's oral history, that the palace was a tied cottage and an icebox. He said it again to other aides over the following years. He said it, on at least one occasion, to a visiting naval friend who repeated it after his death. He did not say it to a reporter. He did not say it in a speech. The palace was where they lived, and where they lived was the Queen's choice as much as Churchill's, and so the matter was closed in public the moment it was decided. A pattern was forming, and it is worth naming it precisely, because the pattern is the promise. Philip's discipline was not a general sweetness of temper. It was not a vow of public blandness. He could be, and frequently was, sharp with staff, abrupt with strangers, impossible at dinner. The line he drew was specific and narrow. It ran around the figure of the Queen. Anything that might, however indirectly, suggest that her husband resented her position, that he disputed her authority, that he found his role a humiliation, was forbidden. Everything else was negotiable. This is the necessary context for the Gaffes, which arrived with such regularity over the following decades that they became, in the press, a kind of running feature. The remarks in China in 1986, the observation to a British student in Papua New Guinea, the Donto pedology jokes, his own coinage, the science of opening one's mouth and putting one's foot in it. Read carefully, almost none of them concerned Elizabeth. Almost none of them concerned the institution's legitimacy. Almost none of them concerned his own position within it. They concerned overwhelmingly other people. Foreign hosts, industrialists, photographers, the press itself. They were, in a sense, the safety valve. The pressure that could not be released in the one direction was released, often crudely, in every other. Parker, who was closer to Philip in the first decade of the reign than any other man, articulated the promise in operational terms in an interview given many years after he had left royal service. Philip's project, he said, was to ensure that the Queen would never have to look over her shoulder and wonder if he was making her job harder. That was the brief he had set himself. That was the standard he measured himself against. Everything else, the temper, the jokes, the impatience with fools, was incidental to the central undertaking. There is a small story Parker told, in private rather than for publication, that captures the thing exactly. Philip was asked once, in a quiet moment, by someone close enough to ask it, what his role actually was. He thought for a second. He said, to make sure she can do hers. It was not delivered as an epigram. It was delivered, Parker said, as a statement of fact, in the same tone in which a man might describe the function of a particular piece of equipment on a ship. There was no self-pity in it, and no self-aggrandizement. It was simply the job, as he had defined it, somewhere between Kenya and Heathrow in February 1952, and as he had been performing it ever since. The aide who heard it kept it to himself. Philip never said it loudly enough to be quoted in his lifetime, and the men who knew him best understood that to repeat it in public while he was still alive to be embarrassed by it, would have been a small violation of the same discipline he had imposed on himself. The promise extended, by a kind of contagion, to the people who served him. They watched him keep it. They did not, while he was alive, describe what they were watching. Parker said it once, in an unguarded moment, to a journalist who did not print it for years, that he had asked Philip, in the early days at the palace, what exactly the job was meant to be. The answer came back without hesitation: to make sure she can do hers. Parker added, with the careful loyalty of a man who had known the Duke for 30 years, that Philip never said it loudly enough to be quoted in his lifetime. It was not a slogan. It was an operating principle, and like most operating principles, it became visible only over decades, in the accumulation of small refusals. Consider the question of the surname, which did not end with the cabinet ruling of April 1952. It lay on the carpet for 8 years. Philip raised it in private, repeatedly, with the patience of a man who had learned that the institution moved at its own speed and that no amount of pressing would accelerate it. The eventual compromise, announced in February 1960, was that descendants of the Queen and the Duke who did not carry royal styles would use the surname Mountbatten Windsor. It was a partial victory. It was also, crucially, not his victory. By 1960, Elizabeth was secure enough in her own authority to take up the matter herself, and it was she who pushed it through, with the Lord Chancellor and the Cabinet of the day. Philip had waited. He had not written letters to the Times. He had not let his frustration spill into a speech or a luncheon remark. The matter had bothered him for 8 years, and he had not, in all that time, made it her problem in public. The relationship with Charles is the second illustration, and a harder one, because it touches on a wound that never quite closed. Philip's disappointment in his eldest son was the kind of household fact that staff learned not to mention. The two men were temperamentally opposed. Philip, who had been schooled in cold dormitories and naval discipline, did not always know what to make of a son who preferred watercolours and conversation with elderly philosophers. There were rows. There were silences. And then, in the early 1990s, the marriage of Charles and the Princess of Wales began its long and public unravelling, and Fleet Street demanded that the Duke of Edinburgh choose a side. He did not. The letters he wrote to Diana during that period, fragments of which entered the public record after her death, were measured and notably humane. He addressed her as "Dearest Diana." He acknowledged faults on his son's part. He counselled patience without insisting on it. The man who could empty a dinner table with a single remark about contemporary architecture understood, in matters that touched the Crown's standing, exactly when to put the pen down and exactly when to pick it up. Whatever he felt about the marriage, about the press, about the slow disaster unspooling around his daughter-in-law, none of it appeared in a microphone or a printed column with his name attached. Then came 1992, the year Elizabeth herself, in her Guildhall speech that November, called an annus horribilis. 3 royal marriages collapsed publicly within 12 months. Windsor Castle caught fire on the 20th of November, her 45th wedding anniversary. The tabloids were merciless. The Prime Minister announced that the Queen would begin paying income tax. Through all of it, Philip's public conduct followed the same pattern it had followed for 40 years. He walked the 2 paces behind. He attended the engagements that had been scheduled. He did not give interviews. He did not, in the parliamentary recess or at the shooting parties at Sandringham, breathe a word that could be carried back to a newspaper. Sir Brian McGrath, who became his treasurer and saw him at close range through that period, later said Philip had treated the year as a stress test, and that his task, as he understood it, was to be the steady hand on her elbow and nothing more. McGrath used those exact words, nothing more. The discipline lay in the restraint. The counter-argument deserves a hearing because it is the obvious one, and any honest account has to meet it. The gaffes, the reported temper, the decades of rumour about his private conduct that filled the gossip columns of 3 continents. Was the promise really kept, or was it merely the public relations version of a more complicated reality? The honest answer is that the private man was difficult and the public consort was disciplined. And those 2 facts coexisted for 70 years without contradiction. Philip could be brusque to the point of cruelty with members of his own staff. He could be impossible at dinner. He had a temper that those who knew him learned to manage rather than confront. The gaffes are real, and they are well documented. The remark to British students in China in 1986 about not staying too long lest they become slitty-eyed. The line to a Scottish driving instructor about how he kept the natives off the booze long enough to pass the test. The catalogue is lengthy and in places indefensible. But it is worth noticing what is absent from it. None of those remarks were about Elizabeth. None of them touched the legitimacy of the monarchy. None of them suggested, even by implication, that he resented his position as her consort. The targets were everyone else: foreign governments, journalists, architects, the various professional classes of the United Kingdom. The one figure his wit never approached, in 7 decades of recorded utterance, was the woman he had married. The biographers with archival access have looked for the exception and have not found it. Giles Brandreth, who interviewed Philip directly for his 2004 study, concluded that the Duke's public discipline regarding the Queen was, in his phrase, the central fact of his adult life. Ingrid Seward, working on the 2020 book that drew on decades of household sources, reached the same conclusion by a different route. Philip Eade's earlier biography, which leaned harder on the difficult private temperament, did not produce a contrary instance either. The private man was difficult. The public consort was immovable. The distinction is not a defence. It is a description. The 2 paces. They became a kind of visual signature, and they were not required of him. Royal protocol permitted the consort to walk beside the sovereign. He chose the distance himself, and he held it for 70 years. Photographs from the 1950s in Australia, from the 1960s in West Africa, from the 1980s in Washington, from the 2000s at state openings of Parliament, all show the same spacing, varied slightly by the demands of a doorway or a receiving line, but never collapsed without her invitation. When she reached for his arm, he gave it. When she did not, he kept the gap. It was not deference in the ceremonial sense. It was a choice, made and remade thousands of times in front of cameras, and it communicated something more specific than respect. It communicated that the centre of gravity in the room was hers, and that he had no intention of competing for it. The same discipline governed his diary. Philip ran a separate household at Buckingham Palace, smaller than the Queen's, staffed by people he had chosen and trusted. The standing instruction to his private office was that his engagements were not to clash with hers on any day of significance. If an invitation came in that might draw cameras away from a state visit she was hosting or a major speech she was giving, the answer was no. By the time he stood down from public duties on the 2nd of August 2017, the court circular recorded more than 22,000 solo engagements over the years of the reign. The remarkable feature of that ledger is not the total, it is the absence. Cross-reference his diary against hers, and the pattern is consistent across decades. He worked on the days she was not the story. On the days she was, he walked the 2 paces and let her be it. Aides interviewed in the years after his death used language that was almost interchangeable. Parker, who died in 2003 and gave his account in the late 1990s, McGrath, who spoke to biographers in the years before his own death. Others further down the household, butlers and equerries and pages, whose recollections surfaced in obituary coverage in April 2021. The phrasing varied, but the substance did not. Philip had said, in effect, at some point in the early months of the reign, that she would be queen and he would be whatever was left over. And he had spent the rest of his life ensuring that what was left over was useful rather than corrosive. None of them claimed he had been easy. All of them claimed he had been, in the one specific matter of supporting her in public, immovable. They said he never broke it. A junior member of his staff, much later, asked him directly. It was near the end, after the retirement, in the quieter rhythm of Windsor. Did he ever regret the bargain? Philip looked at the man for a moment and then said, with the dryness that had become his late style, that it was the only sensible thing to do and that she was worth it. The staff member, who repeated the exchange only after the funeral, said the Duke had not raised his voice and had not seemed, in any way at all, to be performing. It was the only sensible thing to do, and she was worth it. The staff member who heard it kept the remark to themselves until after the funeral, and then offered it without elaboration, in the manner of someone who had been waiting a long time to set a small stone down. By then, the long withdrawal was already complete. On the 2nd of August 2017, Buckingham Palace had announced that the Duke of Edinburgh would retire from public duties. There was no farewell tour. There was no valedictory interview. He attended a final solo engagement at Marlborough House on a wet morning in early August, wearing a bowler hat, joking with Royal Marines, and then he simply stopped. The discipline that had governed 7 decades of public appearances extended, with perfect consistency, into the matter of leaving the stage. He did not want a curtain call. He did not believe he had earned one. In the years that followed, he was seen rarely and almost always at Elizabeth's side rather than in front of a camera of his own. He read. He drove a small electric buggy around Windsor. He carried on a correspondence with scientists, theologians, and old naval friends. He gave no memoir to a publisher, although several were offered. Sir Brian McGrath, who had handled much of his administrative life, said simply that the Duke considered an autobiography to be an act of self-importance he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Then came the pandemic. From the spring of 2020, the household at Windsor Castle contracted to what the press, somewhat romantically, called HMS Bubble. A small group of staff, the Queen and the Duke, sealed off from the wider world. Aides who were present described the atmosphere as unusually domestic. They ate together. They watched television together. There were long walks in the gardens when the weather allowed. More than one observer reached for the same comparison. It was, they said, the closest he had come, since 1951, to the kind of life he had briefly had in Malta, when she had been a naval wife and he had been the commanding officer of HMS Magpie, and the constitutional weight of the United Kingdom had not yet settled across the breakfast table. He died at Windsor on the 9th of April 2021, 2 months short of his 100th birthday. The funeral was held on the 17th of April at St George's Chapel. COVID restrictions limited the congregation to 30. The single image that travelled around the world was of Elizabeth, in black, masked, seated alone in the choir stalls, her hands folded in her lap. The 2 paces behind, observed for 69 years, had become a permanent distance. The choreography that had begun on the Heathrow tarmac in February 1952 had reached its logical end, and there was nothing in the photograph to soften it. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. It is worth, at this distance, asking plainly what the promise had actually consisted of. It was not chivalry. Chivalry is performative, and Philip distrusted performance. It was not romance, in any sense the word is usually given, although by every credible account, the marriage was a love match that deepened with time. It was, more accurately, a working arrangement, negotiated between 2 intelligent people in their 20s, under conditions neither of them had chosen and neither of them could refuse. He gave up his name. He gave up the naval career he had built with real distinction. He gave up the expectation, ordinary in any other British marriage of the period, that he would be the head of his own household, and that his children would carry his surname. In exchange, he claimed something the institution could not reach: an interior life, a set of private convictions, a temper, a sense of humour, a circle of friends who knew him as a man rather than as a consort. And he claimed a marriage that, by the testimony of those closest to it, was the most successful in the modern history of the British monarchy. The aides who served him, over many decades, were not sentimental men. Mike Parker, before his own death in 2003, gave a handful of interviews in which he tried to explain what he had witnessed. Sir Brian McGrath, more reticent, spoke mostly in private. Patricia Mountbatten, his cousin, offered glimpses to Giles Brandreth and to Ingrid Seward. The striking thing, reading their testimony side by side, is the consistency of the language. None of them claimed Philip had been easy. All of them described a man capable of impatience, of sharpness with staff, of remarks at table that made younger relatives wince. None of them claimed he had been a saint in the small matters. All of them claimed that in the one specific matter that defined the bargain, supporting the Queen in public and never permitting his private grievances to undermine her authority, he had been immovable. He had said, in effect, around the time of the accession, "She will be Queen, I will be whatever is left over." They said he never broke the undertaking. They said it in such similar words, across so many years and in such different settings, that the testimony is difficult to dismiss. Return, then, to the image with which this began. A January morning in Kenya, 1952. A young naval officer, 30 years old, summoned out of a fishing lodge by his private secretary and told that his father-in-law is dead, that his wife is now Queen of the United Kingdom and of 15 other realms, and that the life he has been building, the command at sea, the small household, the ordinary marriage, is over. Parker said his face looked as though half the world had dropped on his shoulders. He carried it, by his own arrangement, for the next 69 years. He carried it through the loss of his name, the loss of his career, the loss of his expectation of presiding over his own family. He carried it through the gaffes and the rumours, and the long indignities of being asked, in country after country, what exactly it was that he did. He carried it through the funerals of friends, through the failures of his children's marriages, through the slow attrition of old age. The public never saw him put it down. Elizabeth survived him by 17 months. She wore mourning at the Platinum Jubilee. When she died at Balmoral in September 2022, the courtiers who arranged her funeral noted quietly that the order of service would place her at last beside him in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, and that for the first time in 7 decades, she would be the one who had arrived first. The 2 coffins now lie side by side in a small side chapel off the north choir aisle, beneath a single ledger stone. The choreography that began on the tarmac at Heathrow has, at the very last, been silently inverted. He is the one waiting.